All right, and welcome back, guys. So today I just thought we won't have too long of a lecture. There's not much more to do other than just talking about the kind of conclusion of the civil rights movement, at least this kind of maybe we might call it second wave civil rights here in the 60s, with the kind of disillusion of solidarity. Okay, and what that means is that what we're going to see today is how the movement kind of fractures. That was what you should have talked about yesterday, was the kind of differences between two of these kind of fundamental civil rights leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And their two different methods lead to two essentially different communities. One which is trying to integrate, and one which is kind of, and that's idealistic, and the other which is kind of cynical, which is trying to segregate. And that's kind of a broad generalization. We need to get more specific with that. But nevertheless, I think we can see that the kind of central thrust of Martin Luther King Jr. is, at its core, integration, right? Integration of blacks and whites. Whereas Malcolm X is arguing for a little bit more of just kind of, I guess we might call it segregation, but it's more of just kind of like, it actually reminds me a lot of Pat Singleton. Actually, it reminds me a lot of the old Exodusters movement, where blacks were really up against the wall, feeling that whites would never accept them, and so they had very limited options, living in a kind of a white America. You know, how do you make a community? How do you feel safe for your children, for your family? So I mean, there's a real argument to be made for either one of those, and that's why it's not a coincidence we see those. So anyway, that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, let's just kind of some preliminary stuff. Firstly, I do want to tell y'all how proud I am that everyone is kind of sticking to it. I mean, I feel like everyone is turning in assignments. We're having about 75% of students turn in assignments. That is much more than some other teachers are having. So I'm very proud that a lot of my students are sticking with everything, kind of rising up to the challenge. I know that this is a lot. And some other jobs are easier to transition to online, but I'm very kind of impressed how quickly we were able to do this. I feel like a lot of you are kind of getting the hang of this now. It's only been 3 days. So I'm not trying to be trite or anything. I really am impressed with how quickly and how efficiently everyone's been able to transition online. And the best way to do that, I mean, honestly, the best way to do that is just to, if you have any questions, just please email me. I try and email as quickly as I can, because I know what it's like to email a professor and not get an email back for like 3 weeks. So, yeah, I try and email or respond as quickly as possible. So there's that. The other thing, just about the plagiarism, that kind of got a lot of questions. Nobody plagiarized the work yesterday, so that's nice. At least not that I've seen. I haven't checked it this morning. In any case, the thing about plagiarism is that some of you have had a high percentage rate. And then that kind of freaks you out because you don't want to be caught cheating when you're not cheating, and I understand that. The way Turnitin works is that it'll highlight anything that it kind of sees that doesn't belong to you. So any kind of like phrase, like maybe like 3 words or more. I'm not exactly sure about that kind of technicality, but nevertheless, it'll highlight anything that's not yours. So let's say, there's a bunch of questions. Like, for example, we're going to go over some questions today, and you write the question down, and then underneath it, you answer it. Well, it's going to flag the question because a lot of students are going to put that question in it. So that might raise the percentage, but obviously it's not you cheating. That's just writing down the question. So I don't count that towards your, I don't count it as plagiarism. Likewise, some of these questions they're very difficult to answer in independent ways. There's only so many ways you can say that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. And so a lot of students wrote that in the same way, because not a lot of ways to say that, so it kind of flagged that. And even though that was your response and it was similar, I don't count that as plagiarism. What I count as plagiarism is whenever there's obviously something that's meant to be in your words, and you all say something in a weirdly specific way. It's to ease your mind. It's that it is really obvious when students cheat and when they don't. Okay, it is very obvious whenever a student has just legitimately done the work and when a student has not. So I wouldn't worry about a high percentage rate. I've had students turn in something greater than 50%, and it's just that most of the wording was actually just the questions. So it's whatever. But turn it in is really useful because you can't cheat with it. I mean, you really can't. It is impossible. Even if you change up a few words, which is what students try to do, even if you change up a few words, I still count that as cheating. You can't copy something and change, like let's say you were to copy this. You can't change federal government to U.S. government. It would still highlight all of this as being copied. So, I mean, you really cannot do that. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. If you have any questions about that, please just email me. Let's get started with the kind of response to Martin Luther King Jr. and then we'll kind of end it. There's not too much actually going on here, or at least not much that we have to do. So this might be a short lecture. In any case, so the problem as figures like Malcolm X see it is that what Martin Luther King Jr. is asking for, right? If he really is asking for a kind of manifestation of his dream, that dream once again being a dream of integration, of blacks and whites living together. What Malcolm X is opposed to is he says, well, integration is a kind of cultural assimilation. And let's think about this for a second. To assimilate means to become like something else. And what he's saying is that African American cultures is going to be assimilated to whites. So, not integrated, but destroyed. Okay? So, what he is saying here is ultimately that sorry, is that blacks and whites living together, integration. It's not that integration will. One second. Let me. This is Olivia's thing. Let me turn this off. Oh my God. Okay, there we go. I'm gonna quit Discord as well. Okay. Oopsie. Let's go back. Okay. So, what he's saying is that assimilation is it's not a problem in terms of like stopping civil rights or stopping blacks from getting rights. What he's talking about is that whenever you do integrate, what's going to happen is that it's going to destroy African American culture. So you're not going to have one society of blacks and whites. You're going to have one society of whites with blacks kind of being subservient to the whites again. What he's worried about is that integration is going to see the whites remain in power. So not a new society where blacks and whites live together, but the old society with blacks just kind of giving up on the cause, giving up on the fight. So that's what he's mainly worried about. What he's worried about is a kind of destruction of African American culture. And think about what African American culture has produced so far, right? Scott Joplin, Chuck Berry, Langston Hughes, everything with the Harlem Renaissance. So what Malcolm X is worried about is his own community. He's worried about blacks, and he's worried about them not being recognized for their virtue, for their strengths, for their artistic and cultural capabilities. He's worried that they're just going to be, capitulate. And if, I don't know, maybe you don't know what that word means, because you can look it up. Capitulate, it means to kind of give in to something. So he does not want African Americans to capitulate to the whites, and he thinks that integration is going to take the form of a kind of cultural assimilation, a kind of cultural destruction. So what he does is he kind of becomes a symbol for this Black Power movement, right? The Black Power movement being a kind of more aggressive form of civil rights. Let's look here. Notice how they're a little bit more militant. Notice how they're kind of in like uniforms. They have flags. They have kind of like almost like quasi soldiers. Here they are armed, right? That is the very difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Is that what Malcolm X is arguing for is a kind of community within a community, right? A kind of smaller community finding its way in a larger, wider, and aggressive America. And if you look at like Black history from, I would say at least the Civil War until now, 1860 or 1865 all the way to like 1965, if you want to put it that way. It's that for that 100 years, blacks were systematically kind of stripped of their rights, stripped of their dignity, and so you can kind of see this as a cynical but ultimately realist approach. And the word here in industry, we call this Realpolitik. It's a German word. And Realpolitik means it means something like it's kind of a political doctrine or method which promotes realism, and this is opposed to idealism, right? So if you think about it, there's a lot of ways that you could do politics. There's a lot of ways you can think about a movement. You can think about a movement in an idealistic way. You could say, what are we fighting for? Well, we're fighting for principle. We're fighting for truth. I know that we're going to die. I know that we're going to lose the battle, but I have to hold on to my principles. That would be a very idealistic. So you think about something like the American Revolution, which was fought for like liberty, or it's fought for freedom, or it's fought for democracy as opposed to monarchy. I mean, those are all ideals. Okay, but the rebels of the early American colonies really had no idea how they were actually going to fight the world's strongest military, the world's greatest empire. Right? Not a very realistic war, not a very realistic movement, but it was very idealistic. So Realpolitik actually argues that, well, you got to think on a realistic level. Right? You can't hold fast to these ideals. Some of them are going to have to compromise. So you look at someone like Martin Luther King. I mean, this is an idealistic man. I mean, this is the man who has an idea, right? A dream, and he's fighting for it. And there really is something there. I mean, think about all of the people who we call kind of like great men, like great human beings. Socrates, the Buddha, Martin Luther King, Jesus. Think about how many of them were not realists. Think about how many of them were idealists. Right? Think about how many of them actually were they had a dream, a utopia, a vision of the future, and they worked and ultimately died and sacrificed to make that a reality. I mean, that's where everyone else said it's not possible, it's not realistic. They still did it anyway. All right? So I would say one of the crucial differences between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King is Martin Luther King is something of an idealist, and Malcolm X subscribes to the political doctrine of Realpolitik. He's something of a realist. And that realism is what kind of pushes him to create a kind of black power movement. And I want you to think about that for a moment. Think about the difference between ideals and realism, right? Between idealism and realism. Think about how power is such a realistic thing to take into consideration, right? Most Christians or most Muslims don't care about power. And in fact, they kind of turn it on its head, and they'll say like, well, true power is being humble. True power is being meek. It's very idealistic to not worry about power. It's very realistic to worry about power, right? To worry about who's in control, who's actually calling the shots. So Malcolm X would fire back at MLK and say, well, look. You can talk about your ideals, you can talk about your dream, but at the end of the day, you're going to have power in order to get any of that done, right? You're going to have a real kind of voice in Congress to pass any legislation. So all of this, look, Martin Luther King Jr. couldn't do this. You had to have people in Congress, right? You had to have Congress. You had to have president. You have to convince the people in power. Malcolm X is saying, well, duh. You need power in order to get something done. So there really is a kind of tug of war here between, and this is not just Malcolm X and MLK. This is a larger discussion about politics in general, or political action in general. Is the difference between power, right? Realistic kind of concerns and idealistic concerns about the truth of what they're fighting for, right? That's very, very, very important here. So the difference between Malcolm X and MLK boils down to what are they concerned with, right? The ideals, the very veracity, the truth of what they're arguing for, or is it rather a kind of more down to earth, realistic concern of power? And the problem with power is that it a lot of people are powerful without wielding that power for a good end, right? Great power comes great responsibility. Very, very powerful line. So there you need a little bit of both, I would say. You need a little ideals that to direct that power towards something good, and you need the power to actually exact, to manifest, to effectuate those ends, right? You want to actually have the power to do what you want, and you need the ideals to make it something good that you want. So, that's why I don't think it's a coincidence that Malcolm X, the kind of rejection, or rather the kind of response to MLK, formed something like the Black Power movement, as exactly as it would make sense that MLK the idealist, Malcolm X the realist, power is a very kind of realistic concern. So anyway, this is why we see the rise of this movement called the Black Power movement in the early 1960s. Okay. We'll kind of move on from here. He's shot in 1965 by the black Muslims. Anyway, let's talk about this. The Black Power movement, it morphs into something called the Black Panthers. Okay. A new generation of militant African American leaders. What they're worried about is the failures of Martin Luther King. They think of it as not going far enough. Okay, and notice how this picture here, he looks a lot like T'Challa from Black Panther. They mirrored. I mean, obviously you can't divorce Black Panther. I mean, like the superhero Black Panther from its historical context. I believe Black Panther came out in the 1960s, or maybe 1970s. Either way, it's unavoidable the connotation of calling him Black Panther and saying that he's fighting for civil rights. It's very obvious what they're going for. But what they're arguing about is this kind of militancy, this kind of aggressiveness that they're never going to actually be a part of white society, because white society is just trying to control them again. Integration is a kind of control. So they believe in a kind of a revolution was necessary, that they're going to have to fight to gain their rights. And I mean fight, I mean like violently. So notice how they have weapons, they have uniforms, they have flags. You can definitely see it becoming more militant, more like an army, right? So that's just, here's question one. Who are the Black Panthers? So question one, who are the Black Panthers? And from that, question two, what prompted their formation? What is making, what's kind of starting the Black Panthers here? What are they responding to, right? So question two, what prompted the Black Panthers formation? So, there's what you can see is that as civil rights kind of breaks down, right? As Malcolm X is shot in 1965, as MLK is shot in 1968, Vietnam is raging on. The civil rights movement had fragmented into a lot of these different organizations, and what that means is that it's splitting up that solidarity, splitting up that kind of coherency. Remember, that's what made the bus boycotts in Alabama so successful, was just how they were all sticking together. But as more people are dissenting, as more people are breaking away because they want more rights and they want them faster, that might very well be good. It might very well be good that they want these rights, but they're differing in terms of their methods, right? Some want a revolution, some don't. MLK does not want a revolution, but the Black Panthers do. Okay, so that splintering, that fragmenting of all these, different organizations, different movements, is what kind of leads to the collapse of the civil rights movement in the late '60s. Um, and that's one of the big things to pick out of this kind of final moment here is that the Black Power movement, you can see it as born from a kind of frustration, a new generation frustrated with the sins of their parents. Right? They're not going to put up with the kind of racism that their parents put up with, that they were just kind of emerging out of. They were awakening from. Remember, not every African American actually thought that they had these rights. You had to convince them of that. Now we're in a new generation where they're convinced they are owed these rights. Now the debate is, how are you going to do it? And so some, like the Black Panthers, are arguing in a very realpolitik way, right? They're arguing in a very kind of realistic way that we're going to need this power. We're going to need this symbols of power in order to take what belongs to us, what is rightfully owed to us, right? So they kind of start forming like a paramilitary organization. And the last thing that I wanted to leave off here was a brief discussion on our contemporary issues like the Black Lives Matter movement, which, I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, there's a lot to it. It's very complex, but the Black Lives Matter movement, in a nutshell, was I would say started with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, prompted also by Trayvon Martin in Florida. And the fact that a lot of these news, also I think Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, and Eric Garner, I think in New York, was it? I'm not sure. But the fact that these news stories are just kind of happening in such a rapid succession, they're just happening so quickly, one after the other, it kind of prompted a reawakening of this issue of police brutality. Actually, we might see it as a reawakening of the LA riots of the 1990s. And I'd say that this is a kind of transformation of the civil rights movement of the 60s. And so we're going to get to the LA riots later. This is where we're going to get something like NWA, Rodney King. All of that is the 1990s. And so what that's going to do is the LA riots, we can see, is being born out of the same frustration, the same anger, but also the same kind of compartmentalizing, the same kind of fracturing of the civil rights movement into smaller movements. So the LA riots are not like organized bus boycotts. No. They're riots, right? They're kind of chaos, but they're chaos born out of this frustration that this man Rodney King was beaten by 4 cops in Los Angeles, and it's a kind of transformation of the 60s, right? The 60s sees this massively kind of organized, this showcase of solidarity, and they actually get stuff done. LA riots, they don't really get a lot done. I mean, they definitely angry, a lot of emotion, but they don't get as much done as blacks do in the 60s. And let's talk about like the Black Lives Matter movement. Very, very, very big. I mean, you can see the Black Lives Matter movement as leading to things like the Colin Kaepernick kneeling, protesting the flag for the NFL, leading to a bunch of things, a bunch of protests, counter-protests rather. But the Black Lives Matter movement, by the fact that it was prompted in this new era of like social media, this new era of kind of fractured people, that it's not affecting like a community in a way that the bus boycotts affected like Montgomery. They affected like Alabama. So there's a kind of geographical gravity there, right? So let me just write it down. It's that in the 60s, civil rights was contained to smaller, geographically contained communities, whereas now, we might say that the Black Lives Matter movement spread nationally through social media. And now they're both born out of the same thing. I mean, think about this: the civil rights movement was born out of the murder of people like Emmett Till, right? A young boy, innocent, obviously, and the Black Lives Matter movement by also young black boys like Eric Garner. I'm sorry, like Trayvon Martin, probably one of the biggest examples. It's I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that people saw within the Trayvon Martin story a kind of poetic resonance, a kind of poetic rhyme with the Emmett Till case of in the 1950s of 54. So, I think we definitely see how the Black Lives Matter movement is it's trying to evoke the same memories as the civil rights movement. It's trying to say like, well, there is a history of police brutality, harkening back to the LA riots. There's a history of racism in America, and it's not just individual people, rather it's institutions, it's laws, it's governments, it's exactly as what Malcolm X will be arguing for, which is it's about power. It's about who's in power. So the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to do the same kind of organization, leading protests like Martin Luther King, but they're also arguing in the same way that Malcolm X is arguing. It's kind of a mixture of the two. But what I want you to do is just think for a moment how the Black Lives Matter movement it was not nearly as successful as the civil rights movement. No major legislation was passed. Nobody was really, at least we might say, had justice done. Most of the cops were on paid leave. Most of the cops were found innocent. And I'm not going to weigh in on each individual case. That's too much. But what I will say is that for African Americans living here in the early or kind of, let's see, what 2010s. I'm not exactly sure when it happened. I think it was 2014, 2015. I think was when the first cases were happening. In any case, this movement doesn't really get as much done as the civil rights movement. There's no major legislation passed. There's no major cases and no major justice done. There's no major court cases, yada yada. So why is that? Okay, this is going to be the last question. The last question is this. I want you to compare and contrast the Black Power movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. What do they have in common? And don't just tell for me kind of like, well, Black Power is MLK or Malcolm X and the Black Lives Matter movement and has somebody or like that's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is the question I'm looking for is their methodology and the way that they argue. This is what I'm looking for. Tell me, how are Black Lives Matter movement and the the Black Power movement, how are they similar in the way that they try to go about getting civil rights, right? And how are they different in that? I mean, they might not necessarily be the same. And also, like, how they're arguing. Like, what are they arguing for? Are they arguing idealistically or are they arguing realistically? Okay, so the fourth question, here it is, ready in totality. I want you to compare and contrast the Black Lives Power movement, the Black Power movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. So compare and contrast the Black Power movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And just kind of recap, question 1, who are the Black Panthers? Question 2, what prompted their formation? And question 3, compare and contrast the Black Power movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And that'll be about it for today's lecture. It's kind of a shorter lecture, but it's now that we're done. So one final point here. The essay tomorrow, that's going to take the form of the test. So there's not going to be a multiple choice test. There's just going to be an essay. And the essay question, I'm not telling you exactly what it is, but it's basically going to be something with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And you could probably figure it out. It's probably going to be something about comparing and contrasting them, their methods, taking that paragraph you did and kind of blowing it up into an essay. That's going to take the test, the form of the test. Obviously, we can't do multiple choice tests. So that is how we're going to do this. I would say what you need to do in order to study for that, I would just study the kind of history of Martin Luther King Jr., how he's led ultimately to here, the I Have a Dream speech, right? And then his kind of cynicism and his death at the end. I would say that's what the kind of historical arc I would look for Martin Luther King. And then for Malcolm X, kind of think about him as a leader of a movement in response to him, and the Black Panthers as a kind of response to uh, kind of frustration with how slow the MLK era civil rights movement is going. Right, they're kind of frustrated with how it's not getting everything they want. So that is the essay. It's going to be tomorrow. It's going to be on the differences between MLK and Malcolm X. So you can take that paragraph you did and kind of turn it into an essay, and that is how we're going to do this test. Next week is spring break. We're not going to have any assignments. It's spring break like normal. I'll try and get everything graded from this week. If you have not turned in assignments, I would recommend going back and turning them in. Not just for my class, all your classes. So I guess I look forward to spring break. But we have one more day, so let's just go ahead and get it done. Anyway, I'll see you all later.